The Ypres salient by 1917 was already hell on earth. 3 years of trench warfare have devastated the surrounding countryside. Whole villages in no man's land have simply ceased to exist. The Germans continue to hold the high ground surrounding the British positions in the salient, with clear views for their artillery observers. Most of this land is reclaimed marshland that lies just below sea level and was only habitable because of a network of drainage ditches. Well, 3 years of war have now destroyed that system, and the whole salient is a swamp. The soil isn't conducive to the trenches built elsewhere along the front, and so the Germans have dotted the landscape with strong points, reinforced cement pillboxes. The Allies were not in a good place by the summer of 1917. The French were wavering after mutinies, and the Russians were dealing with revolutions at home. It was up to British Commander Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig to take the pressure off both. After a stunning victory at Messines Ridge on the southern end of the salient, Haig thought it was possible to push the Germans off Passchendaele Ridge to the northeast as well. The preliminary British bombardment in what became the Third Battle of Ypres began on July 16th. 3,000 heavy guns rained shells along the entire German line surrounding the salient. The bombardment lasted for 2 weeks. The advance began on July 31st. It was brutal from the beginning. Men's boots got stuck in the dirt as they struggled over the soft, cratered ground. It was slow, and it was exhausting. Many of the men were carrying up to 80 pounds of equipment. Despite all of this, the initial attack did see some success. The men cleared trenches and dugouts and captured a number of German prisoners. British command judged from the first reports that a breakthrough might be imminent and that the capture of Passchendaele Ridge itself might be possible. The problem was that all they'd really done so far was to take a few forward positions and machine gun outposts. The Germans had abandoned the traditional system of trench lines and had instead focused on a defense in-depth system that went on for miles. So as the British soldiers pushed forward, they suddenly found themselves under well-directed fire from camouflaged strong points, hidden pillboxes, and snipers. They had, in fact, by taking the frontline trenches, just entered the real kill zone. The first waves were mowed down, or soon found themselves isolated from the rest of their units. Then, as the days went on, it began to rain. The steady downpour soaked the entire salient. Every man and gun was soon drenched, and that softened ground now turned into an ugly quagmire of mud and clay. On the battlefield, all sense of direction was lost. The terrain had changed so much that old maps, and even the more recent ones, were completely useless. Corporal Joseph Pincombe of the Queen's Westminster Rifles described what he experienced. He said, quote, "It was an extraordinary panorama, half frightening, half exciting. Everywhere as far as you could see, there were spurts of earth from shells bursting and bursts of shrapnel and high explosives and men looking like ants in the distance. You couldn't speak. The gunfire was so terrific, but you don't really hear the explosions individually. You just see them going off like geysers shooting up in the air. As far as you could see in front of you and to either side, there was nothing but mud, mud, mud for miles, and just a few stumps of trees here and there, and all hell let loose all around you. The stretcher bearers had it especially hard. Each step they took was exhausting. It took 4 to 6 men to carry one stretcher, and even small distances would take hours. At night, the time when most wounded men would normally have been evacuated, the task was simply impossible. The risk was just too high of getting lost or getting stuck in the mud. Many of the wounded died waiting for someone to come, and the Germans shared in their misery, and it was reported that there was an unspoken rule on both sides not to fire on stretcher parties. Lieutenant James Annan of the Royal Scots described it this way. He said, quote, "Then there was a lull in the shelling, and through the machine gun slit on the back wall of the pillbox, we heard this terrible kind of gurgling noise. It was the wounded, lying there sinking, and this liquid mud burying them alive, running over their faces into their mouth and nose. We had to keep heaving the duck boards up and trying to put some other stuff underneath just so that the fellows wouldn't sink so much. We couldn't understand why in the name of God anyone ordered an attack like that over terrain like that. It was impossible. The men had to leave the safety of their trenches as the water rose above their waists in many places. Artillery sank deeper into the mud with every shell fired. Engineers tried to bridge flooded shell holes with pontoons and wooden walkways known as duckboards. There was a constant fear of falling off and drowning in the mud, which operated much like quicksand. Many soldiers suffered the horrible death of sinking into the mud, his friends unable to pull him out. Tens of thousands of men were never recovered from the battlefield. Now, a private in the Royal Fusiliers remembered it this way. He said, quote, "In a way it was worse when the mud didn't suck you down. When it yielded under your feet, you knew that it was a body that you were treading on. It was terrifying. You'd tread on the stomach perhaps, and it would grunt out all the air of its body. It made your hair stand on end. The smell could make you vomit. And you could always tell whether it was a dead Jerry or a dead Tommy. The Germans smelt different in death." There are a number of stories to be told about the Battle of Passchendaele, and we'll be visiting those in the future. But for now, I want to take a look at where the battle finally came to an end. The final push that resulted in the capture of Passchendaele Ridge was made over a 2-week period in late October and early November 1917 by a force made up of Canadian, British, Australian, French, and Belgian divisions. By October 30th, the Canadian Corps had relieved the exhausted 2nd Anzac Corps and prepared for an assault on a position here at Passchendaele Ridge, known as Crest Farm. The assault was successful, and the Canadians eventually drove into the village of Passchendaele itself. Now, fighting would continue until November 10th, when the Third Battle of Ypres finally came to an end. Today, the Passchendaele Canadian Memorial marks the site here at Crest Farm, where the men of the Canadian Corps, who were commanded by Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Currie, finally took possession of the high ground that had been held by the Germans since 1914. Now, before the final assault, General Currie had predicted it would cost the 4 Canadian divisions involved in the fight around 16,000 casualties. In the end, the total was 15,654, including 4,000 dead. 9 Canadian soldiers received the Victoria Cross for their actions here in the last weeks of the battle. The last of those was given to Private James Peter Robertson of the 27th Battalion, Canadian Expeditionary Force. So just to kind of orient ourselves a little bit from here at Crest Farm, down there in the valley, there's this kind of waterway that runs through, kind of a natural divide that was all flooded during the time of the Battle of Passchendaele. And so where I'm standing would have been where the 2nd Canadian Division was, and on the other side of that divide would have been the 1st Canadian Division. They would have been attacking over to the left as we're looking at Passchendaele, over to the left, while the 2nd Division would have been here at Crest Farm, making the final push from Crest Farm up to Passchendaele itself. And then they would have consolidated their position here around the end of October, and then another week to 10 days to push up the hill, take the village of Passchendaele itself, and then push a little beyond, which was their final objective, which they finally reached around November 10th. So this is a fantastic map that gives us a sense of where we are in the midst of all of this. We are right here at Crest Farm, and there's the village of Passchendaele. So this is that direction there. I wish they had put this map and kind of oriented it better, but so we're seeing here that this is where the 27th Battalion attacked on the final push for Passchendaele between the 30th of October and the 8th of November. And the fields behind me that I was showing a little bit earlier are the lines over which the 12th Canadian Infantry Brigade would have been attacking. And then to their left, part of the 1st Canadian Division. You can see the units there that were attacking up and around. But it was the 27th Battalion and the 72nd Battalion that were actually the ones who took Passchendaele itself. Just to put the final push on Passchendaele in perspective, from where I'm standing at the Crest Farm to the church behind me, it's less than half a mile away. It took 10 days for the Canadian soldiers to make the 700 meters between here and there. Quite overwhelming when you think about it. Standing 6'3" tall, Robertson, known as Singing Pete, was popular and a highly regarded soldier who had refused all offers of promotion. A man noted for his willingness to take risks. On the 6th of November, 1917, he was a part of the 27th Battalion advancing toward Passchendaele from here at Crest Farm down toward the church. They followed a creeping barrage as they advanced, but the nearer they came to the village, the fiercer the opposition grew. One machine gun was proving difficult to overcome, blocking the way into the main street, and it was heavily defended. 3 times the platoon had charged, only to be driven back when Robertson decided to do something. While his comrades were firing their Lewis guns and rifles at the machine gun post, Robertson leapt up and sprinted alone across the line of fire, dashing around the flank. He hurdled the barbed wire fence and set about the gun team with his bayonet. Within seconds, 4 men were dead, and the remainder fled. And as they did, Robertson turned their own machine gun on them. This allowed the Canadians to advance through the village, with Peter Robertson at the front of the advance, setting up his captured weapon and using it on repeated occasions with great effect on the Germans. It took about 30 minutes for them to clear Passchendaele, and an hour later, the eastern crest of the ridge beyond the village. The rest of the day was spent consolidating their position, but there were some minor firefights that continued throughout the day. Now, when Robertson saw in one of these later firefights that 2 snipers from his battalion were lying wounded ahead of their own lines, he went out to bring them in. He rescued the first one, but the enemy were beginning to close in, making it more dangerous to go back for the second. But he ignored those risks and went back out again. Captain Theodore Roberts wrote about what happened next. He said, quote, "He fell before reaching the second man. He was probably hit, but he picked himself up and continued on his way and secured his second comrade. Slipping on the sticky mud, nearly exhausted, he stuck to his man and had put him down close to our line when an unlucky shell exploded nearby, killing him instantly." End quote. Private Robertson is buried today in the Tyncott Cemetery. I visited his grave in my video about Tyncott. He was one of the last of over 500,000 men who fell here on the fields of Passchendaele.